So, on this 4th of July, the 245th anniversary of when the Continental Congress in 1776 signed the Declaration of Independence, stating that the intention of the American colonies was to separate from Britain and British rule, I'd like to do some thinking about patriotism. What is patriotism? What isn't patriotism? Who is a patriot and who gets to decide? One of the things I've learned in preparation for this morning is that almost everyone has a strong opinion and strong feelings about patriotism, and that almost everyone, at least the people I've talked to, kind of already think of themselves as experts on patriotism. It's fascinating. One other thing I want to address up front before I get started is that you might think patriotism is not a good topic for church, that it's political rather than spiritual or religious, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I would argue that how you were raised and educated by your country, how you were taught to feel about your country, and how those feelings have changed over the course of your lifetime is a pretty big part of your identity. And whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, your religion and spirituality developed within or in reaction to the context, the mores, the assumptions and culture of this country. They're just not so easy to pull apart. So, patriotism. The framers of the American Constitution, people like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, a few others, are often thought of as the original American patriots, and that's arguably true. It's also arguably true that their design for America, the American government at least, was largely about freeing rich white men like themselves to continue acquiring and exploiting land and the people who worked that land. They wanted limits on democracy. They never wanted common people to be able to make major decisions, and they created the checks and balances with that specifically in mind. The mob of white people, mostly white men, who stormed the Capitol on January 6th to prevent Congress from certifying votes, just this year, were emphatic that they were on a patriotic mission, charged by their president to take their country back, and clearly, no evidence, no facts, and no democratic ideals were going to change their minds. Those folks, and millions who support them, have no ambiguity about what patriotism is. Quite conveniently, for them, it's their way or the highway. You're with them or you're against them. Scholars of democracy all over the world are in remarkable agreement that the obvious really is the obvious, and that these people have confused patriotism with mere nationalism. And at least in the case of the Trump-incited mob, most of them have gone even further, for all practical purposes, confusing patriotism with a mere personality cult. This has proven to be perfectly fine with that particular personality. Big surprise. People of a more liberal bent, even those who have a principled commitment to inclusive democratic ideals, have a much harder and more tenuous relationship with patriotism, especially in the United States, where our claim to being an inclusive democracy is almost as far-fetched as the Proud Boys claiming to be patriots. So I want to share two passages in this exploration from two Black American men. The first is from Frederick Douglass in 1852. The second is from then Senator Obama in June of 2008. Here's Frederick Douglass. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. And here's President Obama, 156 years after Frederick Douglass spoke those words. Then Senator Obama said, Thomas Jefferson was accused by the Federalists of selling out to the French. The anti-Federalists were just as convinced that John Adams was in cahoots with the British, intent on restoring monarchical rule. Likewise, even our wisest presidents have sought sometimes to justify questionable practices on the basis of patriotism. Adams's Alien and Sedition Act, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, Roosevelt's internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, all were defended at the time as expressions of patriotism, and those who disagreed with their policy were sometimes labeled as unpatriotic. In other words, the use of patriotism as a political sword or a political shield is as old as the Republic. Of course, precisely because America isn't perfect, precisely because our ideals constantly demand more from us, patriotism can never be defined as loyalty to any particular leader or government or policy. As Mark Twain, that greatest of American satirists and proud son of Missouri, once wrote, patriotism is supporting your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. The young preacher from Georgia, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who led a movement to help America confront our tragic history of racial injustice and live up to the meaning of our creed, he was a patriot. The young soldier who first spoke about the prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, he is a patriot. Recognizing a wrong being committed in this country's name, insisting that we deliver on the promise of our Constitution, these are the acts of patriots, women and men who are defending what is best in America, and we should never forget that, especially when we disagree with them, especially when they make us uncomfortable with their words. That's part of the American tradition. That's part of why we are proud to be Americans. Unquote. So Obama doesn't mention Frederick Douglass. But by Obama's definition, Frederick Douglass was a fierce and fearless patriot. I read an essay recently that convincingly made the point that in terms of sheer love for the ideals of America and in terms of continually edging us closer to those ideals through sacrifice, activism, truth-telling, and these days even scholarship, no single group of people has been more patriotic than black enslaved people and the wildly diverse descendants of black enslaved people. Isn't that interesting? And this isn't, right, to put every black person on some kind of white fetish pedestal, but it is just to acknowledge out loud that the very people who have shown the most love for the ideals of America are the very people who have experienced the most hate from the reality of America. Isn't that interesting? And wouldn't it be something? Wouldn't it be something if white people in America would just take over that job, collectively say, well done, thank you. We know we messed up. We recognize that making it better is our responsibility. Wouldn't that be something? In the modern United States, as you well know, there is a very large segment of the electorate, almost exclusively white, who strongly prefer a patriotism based on the delusion of American exceptionalism over and above the promise of the ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence. A great many of those citizens are very disappointed that they lost the most recent presidential election, even to the point of supporting an insurrection. Some of these citizens are neighbors, friends, and relatives. I have some. Some of those citizens are duly elected legislators, members of the military, the police, even judges. One of them was recently president. For better or worse, patriotism sells. We're only scratching the surface of liberal patriotism, what it is and what it isn't. But two final thoughts as I try to bring this to a close. I learned recently that many of the great liberal reforms of our national history were framed, that is, were sold to voters as changes that were demanded by patriotism. I'm talking about abolition of slavery, suffrage for women, the New Deal, Social Security, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid and antitrust laws, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and more. All of these were framed, were sold as righting the wrongs of the past and moving us toward a truer expression of our stated patriotic ideals of freedom and equality. So I want to just suggest to the modern Democratic Party, whose platform and PR is often and accurately referred to as a bullet list of policies, I want to suggest to them that they reclaim patriotism as a central selling point. I even suggest doing this maybe even as shamelessly as those who baselessly claim that phony American exceptionalism is patriotism. I think this can be done even while respecting the danger that unchecked patriotism can represent. Second, especially relevant for Unitarian Universalists, listen to the words of the Declaration of Independence. The language is important. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And you can argue that they didn't really mean that, and you'd be right, because they didn't really mean it, or at least they didn't mean it in a literal way. It has been argued, and I think this is argued correctly, that they understood that this was aspirational and not a image of what they were actually doing. I have argued before that this and other foundational documents of Western civilization can be accurately thought of as covenants. That is, they represent an agreement among free people of 1, the moral grounding that will hold them together, 2, the values that they will be accountable to, and 3, the aspirations that they seek to achieve together. In the liberal religious tradition, where Unitarian Universalism proudly stands, covenant is something we understand very well. The principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism begin with the covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and you can hear the echoes of those self-evident truths from the Declaration of Independence. Even as First Unitarian Denver goes even further, teaching that the spiritual grounding for our covenant lies in the unity that makes us one. All souls are sacred and worthy salvation in this life. And we are very clear that we intend this, we think about this. This is a living covenant, that is a mutual agreement among free people that spells out the moral grounding that will hold us together, the values that we will be accountable to, the aspirations we seek to achieve together. We get it, we understand that we're not perfect. We know we don't know everything. We know we're going to make mistakes, a lot of them, all the time. We understand that the best understandings we have today are not the best understandings we will have tomorrow, because we're not finished. It's a journey to get from where we are to where we aspire to be, an evolution, if you will, to expand our consciousness, our inclusion, our assumptions of exactly who and what we mean when we say we. I'm suggesting that this is not just policy work, but it's holy work, sacred work, worthy of our highest, most noble intentions, worthy of our soulful engagement, a daily opportunity to live into the calling of our spiritual tradition. I am not equating our spiritual tradition with patriotism. I think church and state need to be separate, that religion should take place in the context of the cosmos, way over and above the context of a country. But I am suggesting there are clear parallels in the covenants of our tradition and the covenant of this country, and I'm suggesting that Unitarian Universalists have something of incalculable value to offer this country that has always struggled to live up to or even understand its own promises. I think this country needs liberal patriotism, and I think you and I, as people of liberal faith, should live it and claim it and call it such. Thank you, and amen.